Caption: Broadway shows are exactly alike. Caption: Broadway shows are nothing alike. At first glance, the 69th annual Tony Awards looked no different from the 68 that came before, dominated by tap-dancing Shakespeareans, tap-dancing sailors, and a champagne-drunk Vanessa Hudgens, all being presented on the backdrop of grandiose whimsy. Broadway musicals are often hidden from the rest of the world, with the action being confined behind the high-priced walls of a single theater on a single street. That being said, the Tony Awards represents the chance for musicals to wow a global audience with performances that thrive on awe-inspiring spectacle. And then there was Fun Home. Regardless of how huge a success it was off-Broadway, the musical was always going to be a dark horse and a tough sell on the Great White Way in the early 2010s, especially considering it was A, adapted from a graphic novel, and B, featured a lesbian protagonist trying to understand why her closeted father killed himself. Not exactly the lighthearted fare New York tourists came to expect from Broadway. Add in a meager budget, combined with one of the smallest theaters in the theater district, and by April of 2015, the fate of the production seemed sealed. As Sidney Lucas took to the Tony Awards stage, it was clear this would be the last shot to prove there was more to the story than met the eye. The future of Fun Home now rested on the shoulders of an 11-year-old girl. 200 miles outside New York City, there's a town that's also tied together by a single street. Only instead of towering skyscrapers and subway lines, it's bound together by a few streetlights and a string of telephone wires. This is Maple Avenue in Beech Creek, Pennsylvania. Our story of this quaint little community goes all the way back to 1812. Thanks in part to the Beech Creek Railroad, the town became home to flourishing 19th century industries like mining, brickmaking, lumbering, and farming. In the early days, there was never a dull moment in Beech Creek. Stories of fires, robberies, and cars that didn't understand how railroad crossings worked fill the historical records. In the late 1800s, a distinguished gentleman named Joseph Mary set off on a daring quest, lining his entire residential street with a mile's worth of maple trees. Mary stood out in the town as a fixture of the mining, lumbering, and manufacturing industries, but the redevelopment of Maple Avenue became his crowning achievement. The man's life became a maple palooza, culminating in his elegant 3-story estate receiving the title The Maples. As is the case with most small towns that experience a sudden boom, an inevitable period of bust followed. The house that once stood as a towering declaration of prosperity became a bittersweet reminder of the town's withering glory days, fading into the past. By 1961, most people would have written off any renovations to the Maples as a fool's errand. But when Bruce Bechtel purchased the deteriorating home, the restoration became his new obsession. Mr. Bechtel lived a double life, acting as both a high school English teacher and as a third-generation undertaker at the town's funeral home. Much like Joseph Mary before him, Bruce Bechtel set out on his own Maple Avenue odyssey. His romantic appreciation for the past found its way into nearly every decorating decision he made over the next 18 years. The house became a Victorian menagerie of crown molding, mismatched chandeliers, ornate doorknobs, and a statuesque bookshelf looming overhead. And yet, the most striking features of the home didn't lie in the ornamental decor. No, the story of 169 Maple Avenue and of Bruce Bechtel's unrelenting pursuit for perfection was written on the walls. The suffocating barriers wrapped in green William Morris wallpaper. As Alison Bechtel stepped through the doors with a crew from the New York Times, it was like stepping into a perfectly preserved time capsule, for better and for worse. 26 years after Bruce Bechtel's death, his presence still lingered in the home, the mansion littered with the minor faults that proved it was a human who created this. His daughter returned having created a masterpiece of her own. Alison Bechtel was officially a New York Times best-selling author, with her first graphic novel, Fun Home, a family tragicomic, serving as both a memoir of youthful memories and a daughter's investigation to understand a parent's death. Since she was a young teenager, Alison Bechtel questioned her sexuality. After reading countless books and increasing her exposure to homosexuality in college, Bechtel ultimately reached one conclusion: she was gay. Little did Bechtel know, however, that her father was too. A few months after this revelation, Bruce Bechtel was dead. The timing and unresolved reason for his passing left Alison Bechtel's mind filled with so many questions about what led to that day on Route 150. Was her father walking into traffic truly an accident? As Alison Bechtel neared 40 years old, the parallels of her and her father's life weighed on her. They both grew up in the same small Pennsylvania town, and he was gay, and she was gay, and he killed himself, and she became a lesbian cartoonist. The culture of America had changed dramatically since Alison Bechtel started creating comics in college. Having focused all her energy on writing a satirical lesbian comic called Dykes to Watch Out For, the shift in gay acceptance gave her the strength to finally unpack the mystery that was Bruce Bechtel. After spending a vast majority of the 80s in New York's vibrant East Village, Bechtel's home base eventually migrated to Burlington, Vermont. The cartoonist sat down at her desk and started work on her first graphic novel, Fun Home, another name the Bechtel kids used for the funeral home her father worked in. Bechtel describes herself as a careful archivist of her own life. She dug through countless old photos, meticulously studying them to ensure each panel framed a near-perfect recreation of her youth. Considering the significance of the story, Alison Bechtel was understandably nervous when an offer to turn Fun Home into a movie appeared shortly after the novel's release. If the movie came out and it sucked, there was no way Alison Bechtel could stop the spread. A short while later, a new offer found its way to Bechtel's studio. An idea to turn Fun Home into a musical. A celebrated playwright named Lisa Kron believed the story could sing if given the proper outlet. Thinking the proposal over, Bechtel didn't know much about musicals, but admitted it sounded like a pretty cool idea. She knew of Lisa Kron's work with the East Village theater troupe Five Lesbian Brothers, and felt if anyone could represent a lesbian story accurately, it was going to be her. And so, Bechtel was officially on board. For the next year, Kron painstakingly dissected the book page by page, trying to piece together a cohesive through line from the fragmented comic vignettes. The scattered panels primarily circling around the 4 months between Bechtel's coming out and the death of her father. Given the structure of Fun Home, one of Kron's first narrative decisions involved using various actors to represent Alison at different points of her life. While Kron had proven herself to be a talented writer, her experience with the actual musical side of things was practically non-existent. If Crone had any hopes of giving Fun Home the musical treatment, she was gonna need a talented composer to help. Varied doesn't do justice when describing composer Jeanine Tesori's body of work. By 2008, she established herself as one of Broadway's gutsiest composers, and her next musical, featuring an angry green ogre, only added to that reputation. After seeing Tesori's Tony Award-winning musical Caroline or Change 3 times in 2003, Lisa Crone wanted nothing more than to team up with the talented composer. And so, when Tesori told her point blank that she couldn't see Fun Home as a musical, Crone's heart sank. But it was the challenge that was exactly why Tesori wanted to do it. By nature, the graphic novel went against everything traditional Broadway held sacred. The storyline wasn't simple or linear, any 3-act structure was non-existent, and additionally, lesbian roles on Broadway were practically non-existent. To put a lesbian unapologetically front and center as the main protagonist for the first time ever would be bold. And yet, out of all the obstacles standing in the way for Crone and Tesori, the most difficult one was finding the time to actually work on the project. Any hopes of making headway on the show rested on them being able to escape the hustle and bustle of their daily lives. The nighttime chill permeated through the drafty windows of the grand piano room at the White Oak Conservation Center. Originally a Florida refuge for rare and endangered animals, the immaculate estate now housed 2 tireless creatives and 1 massive puzzle. Founded in 1981, the Sundance Institute is one of the premier nonprofits for stage and screen creators. The Institute's theater program played an instrumental role in the development of Lisa Crone's play, Well, and was quick to offer the playwright any support she needed for Fun Home. With a deadline to deliver something impressive for New York's public theater hanging in the balance, Crone and Tesori rarely strayed from the piano side. In an Entertainment Weekly interview, Tesori referred to the early part of the process as doing fabric swatches of the sound to see what the world and soundscape was. And that's when she found it. Inspired by the 1970s setting and the rural country environment of Beech Creek, Tesori gravitated towards the folk acoustic sounds of artist Joni Mitchell. This spirit found its way directly into the first complete song the duo wrote for Fun Home, a vulnerable yet powerful anthem of self-discovery called Ring of Keys. Halfway through Bechdel's graphic novel, 8-year-old Allison sees a butch delivery woman. Even though the sequence is short, just 6 panels long, the significance is pivotal. Bechdel's father always tried dressing her up in fancy dresses and plastered her room with overwhelming floral wallpaper that never matched who she was. The delivery woman's unabashed embrace of her queerness made the young Allison realize that she wasn't alone in her rejection of traditional femininity. It was the first time she saw herself in someone else and experienced some inkling of identity. In just 2 weeks, Crone and Tesori finally had a full outline for the musical. In order to get the piece to work narratively with all the various flashbacks, the show's structure in many ways mirrored the memory play The Glass Menagerie. The story followed adult Alison Bechdel as she wrote the Fun Home graphic novel and pieced together moments of her adolescence. Since the characters and experiences inked on the novel's pages actually existed, the tightrope walk for Fun Home proved extra precarious. Any narrative changes the team implemented weren't just changes to the book. They were changes to Bechdel's actual life. Before Crone and Tesori showed the author the first sample of the music, Lisa Crone sent an email to Bechdel, saying, "Before you listen to it, I want to remind you there are a lot of inventions in this work. We had to change a lot of things and make up a lot of things." Bechtel replied, "Thank you for reminding me." After nervously hitting play on the demo tracks, Bechtel was blown away. As Fun Home entered the public theater for the first reading at Leicester Hall in late 2011, it brought with it a few new team members. First up was director Sam Gold. Gold's interest in Fun Home peaked after overhearing Cronin and Tesori discussing it at the Ojai Playwrights Festival 2 years prior. Gold's first play, Seminar, opened on Broadway to generally favorable reviews, but Fun Home represented his first time directing a musical. Musical veteran Judy Kuhn assumed the role of Alison Bechdel's mother, Helen. Next came the lofty challenge of bringing Alison Bechdel's stage counterpart to life. Wanting to increase the presence of lesbian characters in the theater world, an actress named Beth Malone returned to the East Coast for a musical named The Breakup Notebook. Somewhere in the show's limited 3-week run, in the middle of nowhere, New Jersey, a vacationing Lisa Crone occupied one of the theater's 200 seats and was instantly captivated by Malone. A few months later, Beth Malone entered Leicester Hall for Fun Home's first reading. Though she already knew of Alison Bechdel's work with Dykes to Watch Out For, Malone spent the months leading up to the reading poring over the pages of the Fun Home graphic novel and watching vlogs from Bechdel's YouTube channel. As Malone put it in an article for Broadway.com, "She'd become as much a literary character to me as Gatsby." Just a few moments before the reading started, Janine Tesori pulled Beth Malone aside to introduce her to someone. It was Alison Bechtel. A wave of quiet tension washed over the room as the two Bechtels stood before each other. In many ways, Malone's journey of identity reflected Bechtel's, growing up as a closeted lesbian in a small conservative town with a family extremely dedicated to their values. Growing up, Malone wanted nothing more than to be like her father. However, after she came out to him, the close relationship was severed and he ultimately disowned her. Beth Malone stood toe-to-toe with the woman whose comic once adorned her dorm room wall. After taking each other in, Malone broke the silence by saying, "Wow, this is a weird moment," and walking away. All at once, the story and the lives of Fun Home transcended the page. Following a successful reading at the public, the Sundance Institute invited Fun Home to take part in its summer lab session, this time in Park City, Utah. Gathering in an old barn nestled next to a waterfall, the team got to work. Beth Malone and Judy Kuhn were joined by Raul Esparza in the role of Bruce Bechtel, best known for playing Jonathan Larson in Tick, Tick, Boom off-Broadway. One day, the writers and cast would convene to rehearse, and the next, the writers would be discussing, making changes, and occasionally riding the ski lift up and down to brainstorm. It was clear the show was heading in the right direction, but the challenge of non-linear storytelling became increasingly apparent. The Sundance incarnation of Fun Home focused intently on how adult Alison operated in the show, figuring out if she should always be on stage, if she would see the action happening, and how she perceived what she saw. It also focused on showing more of Bechtel's actual drawings. And then, like a ping pong ball, the show bounced back to the public. Artistic director Oscar Udis suggested what might have been causing the narrative problems. Early versions of the show focused mainly on Alison as a child and as an adult, leaving out some of the most transformational moments in Bechtel's life. In an interview with Broadway Backstory, Udis recalled, "Everything happens to middle Alison. Small Alison is about her being on the steps to realizing she's gay. Older Alison is looking back trying to figure out what happened during that very compressed period of time. Middle Alison's sequence of events is the dramatic center." Meanwhile, newly appointed set and costume designer David Zinn found himself in Burlington, Vermont, as he watched Alison Bechtel nonchalantly sketch a drawing of him in her studio. As an avid Dykes to Watch Out For fan, It was difficult for him to contain his excitement. Zinn and director Sam Gold decided to use Bechdel's studio as the main set for the story. Running with the concept, the two started experimenting with videos, projections, and lights to actually bring a large collection of Alison's drawings to life, thus building on the concepts first introduced at Sundance. However, once the piece actually got on its feet, they found that these elements distracted from the story more than they enhanced it. The off-Broadway set in the Public's Newman Theater embraced the other extreme and sacrificed the spectacle elements in exchange for an empty room. No fancy projections or drawings, just Alison at her table getting ready to tell the audience a story. In his research, Zinn came across a haunting New York Times photo of Bechdel against a never-ending wall of green wallpaper. Using Bechdel's photos of the house as reference, the same trinkets that once populated Bruce Bechdel's palace came to life again on the Newman Theater stage. Antique puzzle pieces in Alison Bechdel's investigation of her father.
There may be some in this auditorium. There may be some here today that will be homosexual in the future. There are a lot of kids here. There may be some girls that'll turn lesbian. We don't know. But it's serious. Don't kid yourselves about it. They can be anywhere. They can be judges, lawyers. We ought to know we've arrested all of them.
Bruce Bechdel didn't have the luxury of openly expressing his identity in the same way Alison would. They grew up on different sides of the Stonewall riots, their experiences being gay standing in stark contrast to each other. Alison grew up at a time when the calls for liberation grew loud. Bruce grew up at a time where those who were gay were told to stay silent. The nuclear family was king, a certain status quo Bruce and many others embraced out of fear of being arrested or even killed. The interior design of the house served as one of the only ways Bruce could vent his identity. This realization found its way into the off-Broadway show. The story shifted focus away from solely Alison as a cartoonist and keyed in on the dramatic turmoil inside Bruce. Tackling roles from John Wilkes Booth to Sweeney Todd, actor Michael Cerveris knew how to play characters with a dark side. But to Cerveris, Bruce wasn't a villain. He was resentful about being forced into a solitary life, denying his feelings, and tragically, searching to understand himself. On the flip side of that coin, Crone and Tesori didn't want to shy away from exploring the joy and bliss that came with Alison openly embracing her sexuality. When writing the show, the real Alison Bechdel gave them the workbook she kept while writing Fun Home, which included photocopied sections from her college journal. Many of the pages relished in the incredible feeling of coming out. To highlight the overwhelming experience of Alison's first time, the team wrote the song Changing My Major. The music feeds directly into Lisa Crone's stream of conscious dialogue, as medium Alison tries to find the words to express what she's feeling. The extensive rewrites for Fun Home continued all the way up to opening night off-Broadway. From Ojai, to Sundance, to the Public, back to Sundance, and back to the Public, Fun Home was never presented to a large audience not involved in the production. And so, the fear of backlash over a story featuring a lesbian coming-of-age story consistently loomed overhead. Lisa Crone herself worried people would ridicule the idea of an 8-year-old girl singing about a butch lesbian in a diner. But the world was heading in a new direction. On a legislative side, more and more courts affirmed that denying same-sex couples the right to marry was unconstitutional. LGBTQ+ characters were increasingly represented in television shows and movies. Gay marriage was legal in over 14 states, and in early 2012, Barack Obama became the first sitting president to openly announce his support for same-sex marriage. The United States' understanding and acceptance was growing. And so Fun Home opened off-Broadway at the perfect time. As Fun Home took to the stage, a scheduling conflict left Alison Bechtel trapped in a hotel room in Ohio. The cartoonist repeatedly hit refresh on the New York Times website, anxiously waiting to see what the reviews would say. And then it appeared. The head critic of the New York Times was infamous for being extremely hard to please, making it all the more shocking when his first sentence called the show a beautiful heartbreaker. The newspapers unanimously declared Fun Home was a masterpiece, but the critics the team really wanted to impress came to a matinee performance a short while later. Alison Bechtel walked inside the public alongside her brothers Christian and John, her cousin-in-law, and her 90-year-old aunt. As the children of a mortician, the Bechtel siblings were no strangers to the phenomenon of death, which made it even more difficult to grieve after their father's passing. There were no tears, just confusion and irritation. Now, 30 years later, after the cast took their final bows, a grown-up Alison and her brothers finally broke down in each other's arms. A long-awaited moment of catharsis. In relation to a Broadway scene dominated by flying Spider-Men, telekinetic children, and falling chandeliers, Fun Home didn't seem like the type of show that could survive a transfer to the commercially conservative Great White Way. Unlike other musicals with broad commercial appeal, Fun Home's intimate tale dealt with some pretty polarizing topics. As far as Crone and Tesori saw it, Off-Broadway was as good as it was going to get. But then, Fun Home's run at the public got extended. And then it got extended again. And again. And again. Producers noticed that realistically, the musical could have kept extending for the foreseeable future were it not for a new show, called Hamilton, moving into the theater in January of 2014. And now, a crazy, exciting, and terrifying proposition faced the entire team. Could Fun Home actually survive on Broadway?
Hi, I major in Sovereigns for CFCC. How much trouble can one book cause? How about public uproar, government interference, and possible funding cuts? Fun Home, an autobiography by Alison Bechtel, is just one of many books from around the world to be followed by such public backlash.
Alison Bechtel was no stranger to controversy. Dating back to its release, her graphic novel was the target of countless banning attempts. 3 months before Fun Home opened at the public, a lobbying organization in South Carolina called the Palmetto Family Council criticized the College of Charleston for recommending the book to incoming freshmen. Regardless, the college stood by its decision, but in March of 2014, the South Carolina House of Representatives approved a budget that cut the college's funding by $52,000, the exact dollar amount it spent to buy the books. The cast of Fun Home journeyed to Charleston to stage back-to-back benefit concerts as a way to provide support for the school. Ultimately, the legislative attack on Fun Home actually led to a spike in interest for the novel. The story's popularity continued to grow. The musical became a finalist for the 2014 Pulitzer Prize in Drama, and Alison Bechtel received the MacArthur Genius Grant. Later that year, director Sam Gold, set designer David Zinn, and lighting designer Ben Stanton found themselves on Broadway inside the Circle in the Square Theater. The space offered none of the elements they'd used thus far to tell the story. The musical was originally presented in a proscenium style, with all the actors facing out towards an imaginary fourth wall. But at Circle in the Square, the fourth wall vanished, with every corner being surrounded by seating. The more they thought about it, the more the venue seemed like it would be an impossible place to tell the story. And yet, the trio couldn't deny that Circle possessed a beautiful intimacy that other Broadway theaters just didn't. And soon enough, the musical found its new home. This left David Zinn to completely rethink his design of the show. Off-Broadway, the main centerpiece was a giant turntable, which swirled objects, furniture, and people around a stationary Allison. But once they started working on the show at Circle, Zinn realized the turntable no longer felt important. As Zinn put it in an interview with Wait in the Wings, you don't need to spin the story around because everybody's already surrounding every side of it. Even though Zinn nixed the main turntable for Broadway, he did keep a smaller one for a number finding Allison and her father on their last car ride together, a song called Telephone Wire. Zinn next needed to devise a way to get the furniture on and off stage. The ceiling in the space was very low, leaving them with barely enough real estate to drop down a few chandeliers. But while the space didn't have a lot of room in the ceiling, it did have a deep underground trap room connected to dozens of hidden elevators. Zinn pictured the floor of the stage as though they'd sawed off the top of the actual house in Beech Creek, concocting a ghost of a house embedded in the floor. Throughout the show, pieces of the furniture descended into a pit, where a team of just 2 crew members would replace the furniture or objects as needed. Up above, the elevators briefly left noticeable holes in the floor before automatically being covered up. During Bruce's final song, Edges of the World, Allison desperately tries to cling on to any reminders of her father, only for them to vanish from her reach. The traps allowed the props to disappear seamlessly into the ground. The sequence by itself was already powerful, but the emotional weight elevated during a run-through where they decided not to cover the holes after the objects disappeared, thus inadvertently making those gaps a crucial narrative device. Dramaturg Eli Cohen sums up Bruce's mindset in this moment the best. Bruce lived his entire life with internalized homophobia, from society calling him a monster for being gay. So Allison openly exploring her identity with the gay union meetings, and especially with Joan, was something Bruce never got. Watching the hostile world he was forced to grow up in change into a more accepting one overnight was a reality that he just couldn't reconcile with, causing him to inch closer and closer to the edge until... Before long, the finishing touches of the Circle in the Square production took place. Creatively, the musical became even more impressive than its off-Broadway run. But now, they needed to get the general public to see that. No phrase is uttered more in Broadway theater than "you're crazy." And honestly, when it comes to staging a show in a place that caters to over 14 million people, one has to be. Shows like Phantom of the Opera, Lion King, and Wicked continuously dominate, since they're family-friendly mainstream phenomenons that appeal to families and 40-year-old tourists. Fun Home didn't have that luxury. The show's meager $5.25 million budget and niche source material positioned it as a major underdog for the season. The producers knew the show required a total rebrand to cater to as many people as possible, and so they approached Broadway marketing agency Spotco. As stated in an Atlantic article, Spotco's chief strategy officer believed the main goal for Fun Home's marketing was to make sure it was never associated specifically with the plot or the subject matter. The muted and gothic tone of Bechdel's graphic novel transformed into a vibrant and colorful 1970s aesthetic. Any possible embrace of the monumental moment for LGBTQ representation in theater was ignored. The advertisements focused on a story Spotco figured everyone could accept, one of a father and a daughter. And thus, any hint of non-traditional values were tucked behind the family-friendly wallpaper. On April 19th, 2015, Fun Home officially opened at Circle in the Square. Once again, critically, the piece received raving reviews, but commercially, it was a different story. On the week ending April 26, 2015, a flashy new musical based on the 1951 film An American in Paris raked in $1,235,000. Meanwhile, Fun Home's first week only brought in $436,000. As the weeks passed, the momentum behind An American in Paris propelled the show closer and closer to breaking the $1.5 million mark, as Fun Home remained trapped in the $500,000 to $600,000 range. An American in Paris seemed to have it all. A spectacular budget of $11 million, the prestige of being a well-known Gene Kelly film, elaborate dance numbers, and impressive performances by actors like Rebecca the musical survivor Jill Pace. They also had a much bigger theater. Coming in at only 730 seats, Circle in the Square wasn't exactly the largest of Broadway's venues, and it had yet to house a Tony Award-winning production. Considering the massive competition, the odds of Fun Home winning the coveted prize for Best Musical appeared to be highly unlikely, and yet any possibility of the show's future relied heavily on the Tony Awards that June. Around the same time, debates in the Supreme Court were well underway for a case challenging the prohibition of same-sex marriage, Obergefell v. Hodges. Debates amongst the Fun Home team also started to pick up steam at this time, but for a slightly different reason. In a Tony ceremony destined to be filled with show-stopping, high-energy performances, the executive producers for the awards encouraged them to perform Come to the Fun Home for their musical number. The song, featuring the three Bechtel children rocking out to a made-up commercial for the family funeral home, was the go-to number for any of Fun Home's live TV performances. But to Lisa Kron, only one song truly embodied the heart of the show, and it was the one that she initially feared people would reject, Ring of Keys. And so, on June 7th, 2015, a brave 11-year-old Cindy Lucas took center stage at the 69th Annual Tony Awards. The 6,000-seat venue engulfed Circle in the Square 10 times over. Lucas's performance on this night not only served as a chance to get more eyes on Fun Home, but also to make a powerful declaration. A declaration of self-identification, a declaration of representation, a declaration of understanding. Following the performance, the evening became an intense battle between two incredibly different shows, An American in Paris and Fun Home. Fun Home's Sam Gold won for Best Direction, Michael Cerveris for his performance as Bruce, and Lisa Kron and Janine Tesori made history as the first all-female writing team to win for Best Original Score. A major moment in theatrical history that was awarded during a commercial break. As the night came to a close, An American in Paris and Fun Home tied at 4 awards apiece. Only one remained: Best Musical. A hush fell over Radio City Music Hall as the envelope was opened.
And the Tony Award goes to, bravo, Fun Home.
To the American Theater Wing and the Broadway League, everyone in the entire Fun Home family is forever grateful. You have changed our major to miracle.
But our foremost gratitude goes out to Alison Bechtel. You had the courage to share your family story. You trusted us to put it on Broadway, and now our audiences are finding a way to understand and love their families. Thank you!
In a Tony season dominated by a slew of traditional, big-budget shows, Fun Home, the little musical that was never supposed to make it on Broadway, walked away with the most awards of the night. The box office numbers for Fun Home soared following the Tony Awards, and the arguably most special performance for the show came on June 26, 2015. A landmark 5-4 decision ruled that banning same-sex marriage went against the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, thus legalizing it in all 50 states. On June 26, 2015, it felt like love finally won in America. In March of 2016, Samantha Power brought a group of United Nations ambassadors representing 17 countries to see the show. 2 were from countries where being gay is still considered a crime. As Ambassador Power put it, Fun Home did a brilliant job of humanizing its subject in a way that made them thoroughly accessible to other ambassadors. The performance even left one ambassador from El Salvador saying, "What is the message? To me, it is very clear. You are telling us, look, you are me, we are together, and we are the same." The message of LGBTQIA+ acceptance was spreading, but oppression and violence didn't end with the right to marriage. Nearly 1 year after the momentous day of love and celebration following the Supreme Court decision, a gunman in Orlando, Florida opened fire at Pulse nightclub, resulting in the death of 49 people and 53 injuries. Fun Home's performance that night ended with a moment of silence and a realization that the musical would never feel the same. As Michael Cerveris recalled in a piece for the New York Times, the weight of the show became heavier, and backstage, the cast and crew talked about how they felt helpless and like they needed to do something. Cerveris suggested staging a one-night benefit concert in Orlando to help those who had been affected. Nearly as fast as he suggested it, the team headed down to Florida. The benefit raised $113,000 for the LGBTQ nonprofit Equality Florida and for the victims and families of the shooting. Even more importantly, it provided those in the audience a moment of solace. After just 1 year on Broadway, Fun Home's ticket sales began to decline. However, thanks to the minimal design of the show, the production successfully recouped its $5 million investment in just 8 months. But by June, with weekly grosses declining, producers decided it was time to leave Broadway and start working on a national tour. Fun Home played its final performance on September 10th, 2016. After a nearly 10-year groundbreaking journey, 26 previews, and 582 performances. A few months before rehearsals began for Fun Home on Broadway, Michael Cerveris discovered that someone converted Alison Bechdel's old home in Beech Creek into a vacation rental. The majority of the cast, as well as Alison Bechdel, her wife, and her brother, journeyed to Maple Avenue to experience the actual home that solely lived in their imaginations. All these years later, and Bruce Bechdel's life project appeared untouched, complemented by the same towering maple trees Joseph Mary planted 100 years before. Both are inevitably destined to erode, the weathering hands of time breaking each down until they're unrecognizable. The wood will decay, the wallpaper will peel. And yet, the significance of each will continue to live on long after the physical structures are gone. The same can be said for Fun Home. Both the book and the musical revolutionarily and unapologetically brought the struggle of personal identification to the forefront. What's more, they introduced it in mediums where it wasn't typically seen.
To have somebody that's a fully realized human being and dealing with all of the things that everybody has to deal with even when it doesn't line up with your experience completely, the way in which you feel seen by it is kind of astonishing.
I would have came out if I knew that there were other Black trans women. I was just afraid that, like, I was going to die. Like, that was my biggest fear.
We're gonna be great. The future is very gay and it's very full of people of color. But like, I have to celebrate those small victories, or like this industry will swallow all of us.
While this is like, these are what the stories we want to hear, it won't happen if we don't let LGBT writers in the room, if we don't let LGBT producers, actors, and creatives. It's just a matter of making space and demanding that they be seen as well. And they deserve to be seen. They need to be seen. It's the only way we can, move forward.
While I wish I could tell you that Fun Home radically changed the Broadway landscape overnight, I can't. In 1985, Alison Bechtel wrote a comic strip called The Rule, which introduced something that would become known as the Bechdel test. The test was created as a way to measure the representation of women in fiction. Broadway is still failing the Bechdel test, especially if you expand the scope to include all underrepresented communities. What's more, as a society, the attacks against members of the LGBTQIA+ community are still as rampant as ever.
A controversial new law went into effect in Florida this week, coined by opponents as the Don't Say Gay bill.
We will make sure that parents can send their kids to school to get an education, not an indoctrination.
Governor Greg Abbott is ordering people in his state to investigate gender-affirming care for transgender children as child abuse.
Tonight, federal authorities are on alert after police in Idaho say they prevented a possible domestic terror attack over the weekend.
Police say they also recovered at least one smoke grenade and paperwork similar to a military operations plan. The men clad in riot gear and masks, one of them wearing a shirt with the words, "Reclaim America."
Why do so many leap to tearing down the things they don't understand instead of challenging their preconceived notions first? And why does it seem like we're so afraid to openly tell the stories that can change our biases? Accurate representation was one of the most important things Fun Home achieved. That being said, it's important to remember that Fun Home is specifically a white lesbian story that's not reflective of all sexual orientations or life experiences. And while the leap in representation was huge, we still have a long way to go. Even though it's frustrating that there's so much bullshit stalling Broadway's evolution, change takes time. Caption. Every so often, there comes a rare moment of perfect balance, where a show can soar above.
Give me a chance to shine a light.